Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, a podcast about leftism, Christianity, and the UK that believes everyone would happily sing the national anthem if we just changed it to Angels by Robbie Williams. I'm Ben Molyneux-Hetherington, and I'm joined by Adam Spears. Adam, why does Lee Carsley hate England?
Well, probably because he's an Irishman. You know,
Yeah.
he played 40 times for Ireland. So it's really quite funny to see people getting really pissed off about that.
So for those people who haven't seen it somehow, those lucky few, why don't you tell us what I'm referring to?
So Lee Carsley is the sort of interim England manager after what am I trying to say? Sareth Southgate.
Southgate, yeah.
Yeah, Sareth Southgate. After I nearly said it again. After Gareth Southgate left. And Lee Carsley was born in Birmingham, but he represented Ireland. He played 40 times for Ireland. And he said earlier this week that, no, he's not going to sing the national anthem. He's not going to sing God Save the King. And he didn't his reason for that was basically that he's just going to be thinking about preparing for the match, blah, blah, blah. And clearly it's because he played 40 times for Ireland, but he's not going to say that because he's trying to tread this line between not pissing off the Irish and not pissing off the English. So it's quite funny to kind of watch him tread that line. I think he's kind of handled it quite well. Whereas probably you and I would be like, yeah, we're not going to sing God Save the King because it's bourgeois nationalist crap, you know. He's obviously got to tread a bit of a more careful line there. But yeah, there's a lot of people, predominantly terminally online, who have just absolutely lost their shit over this. You know, the idea that an Irishman wouldn't want to sing the national anthem. It's like, let me tell you about some historical stuff that happened, you know? It made me laugh, actually. So I saw a comment someone wrote where it was like, oh, they don't want to sing the national anthem, but they all want to come here. And I'm like, yeah, think about the context of colonialism, and there might be a link between those two things.
Yeah, and obviously there's this complex identity things, you know, two players who play for England now but have both represented Ireland at age grade in the past scored. And
the only two scorers are former Irish. But they both played, certainly one of them played 3 times for the full men's team in friendlies, I think.
Yeah. Which I think that's kind of quite funny. I saw someone say, you know, who's going to score next? The ghost of Oliver Cromwell.
Wow. Whoa.
But I think it speaks to that obvious, you know, entwining of national identities there, right? Actually, there are lots of people who are English and Irish, and that is a far more meaningful thing than claiming you're Irish when you're an American.
I mean, I was about to say that I don't really pay a lot of heed to any of these nationalisms, but I agree with you on that point.
Yeah, and obviously Irish nationalism is a very different thing to English nationalism or even British nationalism, right? There's a different context and stuff there or whatever. But I do think ultimately there are lots of people who would consider themselves to be both Irish and English, but in the context of it being the Irish national team versus the English national team, there's always going to be some element of historic issues at play there that's going to kind of be involved. But yeah, the idea that someone who's played for Ireland 40-odd times should then sing the English national anthem is just absurd to care about, absurd to even notice. It's all just quite silly.
And that's before you even get into the whole Republican monarchist kind of element of it as well, because obviously there's a lot of people who would say, oh yeah, I'm proud to be English, but they wouldn't sing the national anthem because they don't believe that there should be an unelected head of state.
Which brings us back to my initial point that the national anthem should be Angels by Robbie Williams.
How did you come up with Angels by Robbie Williams as the...
It's a song that's impossible not to sing along to.
I don't know the words.
You don't know that cannot possibly be true.
I know the song, I know the song you're referring to, but I tend to stay away from things like weddings and, you know, fun.
I think there's a difference between staying away and not being invited, but let's move on.
Well, one thing I did want to say quickly, your point, just bringing it back quickly to the whole Irish nationalism being a bit different to English nationalism. I think that, broadly speaking, that is true. But what I will say is that there is now a growing far-right movement in Ireland that it's really important to acknowledge. And actually, there have always been far-right elements in Ireland. There were quite a lot of phalangist fighters in Spain that came from Ireland. So I think that's a really important element to remember in that as well, which is, obviously not to sort of say that Ireland is this hotbed of fascism, because it's not, but it of course exists.
So Lee Carsley probably supported Franco. That's what I've got from that. Is that about right?
Wow. And that's the reason he didn't sing. I mean, like, our government supported Franco basically as well.
Yeah. So no, yeah, okay. So it's the opposite. You're saying Lee Carsley didn't sing the national anthem because he's extremely anti-Franco. That seems fair. So today we are going to do a classic style of Bread and Rosaries episode where Adam sends me something to watch or listen to, knowing that I will absolutely hate it, but forcing me to do it anyway. We're going to talk a little bit about a kind of a speech and an article written by someone about the relationship between kind of Christian charities and the state, and how to navigate that. We have some points of agreement and some fairly stark points of disagreement with it, and it'll be interesting to unpack a little bit some of the ideas around charity, particularly kind of Christian charities and how that functions. But before we get onto that, we will start, as always, with what else is on my mind, Grapes.
What else is on my mind, Grapes?
Adam, what's on your mind, Grapes?
Okay, so it is back to school time, which means a flurry of articles about parents and students being really angry at what they call draconian uniform rules. And you and I think in the past have sort of disagreed on this a little bit. I don't think you're like a big uniform guy, but like it's just not a particular concern of you. I hate uniforms. I hate them with a burning, fiery passion, and I want them gone. And part of the reason I want them gone is because I think they are part of a system that's designed to essentially do what George Carlin called, making you an obedient worker. They're there to make you conform.
There's a reason for this. There's a reason education sucks, and it's the same reason that it will never, ever, ever be fixed. It's never going to get any better. Don't look for it. Be happy with what you got. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers.
And so we've seen a bunch of these articles. The one I sent you is a BBC article, which is not the worst news site that I have linked in today's show notes. It has a Daily Mail link today, so I'm sorry about that. But yeah, this one is Parents' Dismay at Draconian Uniform Rules. And part of the reason I thought this was quite an interesting article, or rather part of the reason I shared this, is because it has Steve Chalk making an appearance in it. Who, Steve Chalk is someone that we, again, similarly to what we were saying a moment ago, we would have points of agreement and points of disagreement with. I think he's
Absolutely.
a decent guy who cares. I think I would have some disagreements with some of the ways he thinks about social change, social action, social justice, that kind of thing. But one of the things that Steve Chalk does is that he founded the Oasis Charitable Trust, which runs a bunch of schools, a bunch of academies around the country. So a lot of people will have heard of various schools that are called Oasis this or Oasis that. And a lot of the time they're connected to churches as well, because Oasis originally was the church that he was the Baptist minister at. So Oasis Waterloo in London.
And Oasis is obviously, probably the standard bearer of what you might call a progressive evangelical church in the UK.
Yeah, he was making all the news and being disowned by evangelicals, 15 years ago or something?
Yes.
When he said that basically he believed that same-sex marriage was fine and became openly affirming. So, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and there's been some controversy over, he's worked quite hard on some trans inclusion issues as well, which is great.
Yeah.
His first time he got disowned, actually, was over his views on atonement theory, where he described substitutionary atonement, where Jesus takes the place of sinners, as a theory of understanding what happens at the cross, as essentially cosmic child abuse.
Which is true.
Yeah, well, I mean, I say.
Which is just clearly true.
We've not got to any of our points of disagreement with him yet, yeah.
No. And actually, his take on this whole school uniform issue, I think, has been pretty measured as well. I was quite surprised and impressed, actually, with what he said, because speaking to BBC Look North, so I'm quoting from the article now, so he's the leader of the Oasis Charitable Trust, which runs some academies in North Lincolnshire, which I think is where some of the examples in this article come from. He said, it doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound right at all, because schools are meant to be welcoming. He said concerns over pupils' uniforms needed to begin with conversations with families rather than sanctions. He added, schools need standards, but one of those standards needs to be inclusion.
I really like that last line. I think that's a really good way of putting it.
I think, look, Steve Chalk and I are going to disagree on uniform fundamentally, right? Like, I don't think there should be uniforms. He will think that there should be, but he's more chill on it than a lot of people are. And I think you're right. Yeah, that's a decent final line. I think he's right to be dismayed, because when you read this article and when you read a lot of these articles, and I tend to, because this is a bit of a sort of minor bugbear of mine, I tend to read a lot of these articles every time there's a new academic year. And they are draconian. Schools have moved to a very, very kind of authoritarian model in which school uniform plays a really important role. So a lot of schools have introduced school uniforms that are, I mean, weirdly, actually, they're mimicking sort of traditional business dress, which is quite funny because a lot of businesses now are dressing down.
Yeah, absolutely. No one wears a full suit anymore, apart from teachers. That's the only people who do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you've got these kids walking around in blazers and ties, and and they're told they're not allowed to take off their blazer in the when it's really hot weather. And actually, the example that is in this thing is the shoes that this girl was told she couldn't wear anymore. Can you just describe those shoes for me?
They're kind of black, shiny, smart shoes.
Like brogues, aren't they?
I'd say, is it brogues when they have the holes in the top?
I think
so. So they're fancy shoes, but I would imagine that they're too shiny and the wrong sort of shoe. And actually, this is an issue you see all the time, right? Particularly start of academic year, but it's like broken window theory of policing, the idea that you need to kind of fix all the little minor things in order to make the big things go away.
Exactly.
There's two aspects to it, I think. One is to say that actually shoes are expensive.
Mm-hmm. So are the rest of the uniforms as well,
Yeah. And actually you are to be able to spend money on stuff. But also there's an element, as you said, I'm slightly less anti-uniform than you. And I think there's an element of
fascist.
Just actually that it kind of declasses and kind of takes away some of those issues.
Which we disagree on, by the way. I think that's a bad argument.
So I'm not necessarily anti-uniform like you are, but actually there needs to be a bit of give and take, right? Like actually, predominantly black shoes seems reasonable, but what you've got here is a list. Let me see if I can find it, because it was an amazing list. So these are the rules about shoes that the school apparently enforce. Plain black, round-toed, flat, polishable shoes, which is such a specific...
I mean, are these not...
They're not plain black, they're shiny. That's the only problem with them.
But the plain doesn't... Plain to me implies that there are no other colours on there, right? And no patterns or whatever. Do you know what I mean?
I think they mean matte black.
But they need to say then, don't they?
But the fact that we've been having this conversation tells you what a stupid conversation this whole thing is, right? Like, actually, it'd be one thing if this person showed up in their new Jordan high tops to school.
It'd be rad.
Well, sure. if you support sweatshop labour. But
there it is.
He says currently wearing Nike trainers.
Hypocrite. Hypocrites everywhere.
Hey man, do you ever know how hard it is to find size 14 shoes? I'll take what I can get. They are off Vinted though, so that if that makes it any better.
It doesn't. I don't know why it doesn't, but it's
yeah,
you,
yeah,
so
because
it
it's me.
doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't even know what Vinted is, by the way.
I'm not going to explain to you right now. The other thing, of course, is that teachers hate doing this stuff. They did not. The vast majority of teachers didn't get into teaching to do this.
Yeah, I mean, some of them love it.
Yeah.
But yeah, most of them don't.
And, actually, the newer generation of teachers don't care for this stuff, right? Like, there's an old school generation that is occasionally slightly more that way inclined. But yeah, it's just a waste of everyone's time, isn't it?
But I think this speaks to how education has gone. And very quickly, the examples made in this article are these shoes, where they're exactly the same shoes as the ones she wore the year before, and apparently the rules haven't changed. And the issue with it is not only that just is inconsistent and confusing, but the reason I say it speaks to the way schooling has gone and how it's become very, very authoritarian is because she was put into isolation for this, right? Or rather, actually, I think she was told isolation or go home, right? And so the argument that a lot of these people who push for these very authoritarian standards go for is that basically you need to have these standards in order to stop disruption so that everyone can learn, right? And actually what's happening here is she's not disrupting anyone, but she's being told she's not allowed to learn. It doesn't make sense. That's where I'll leave it. Because otherwise I'll go off on a rant.
Yeah, I basically have to stop you doing a full episode on uniforms. That's my job here.
Well, on schools in general, actually, because I'm someone who's worked in education for many years, and I have opinions, man.
You being opinionated, shocking.
I know.
Let us move on to our main topic of the day. Adam, you sent me something to listen to because you don't like me to enjoy my life. As we've discussed before, you have a very know your enemy approach to stuff, where you like to kind of hear what people you disagree with are saying. I don't care that much.
Just in a liberal echo chamber, aren't you? These lefty liberal cucks. All they could do is listen to the same people. I'm just. You've got to stop me, otherwise I'll just carry on in this kind of Jordan Peterson-esque fashion.
It was actually a really interesting listen, honestly. So I listened to the recorded version of this talk, which was by a man called Jon Kuhrt, who is the CEO of the charity Hope Into Action. And it was a talk about the charity sector and kind of the ways he sees it failing. And it was for an organisation called Together for the Common Good, which is a kind of non-partisan political organisation that kind of works to do a kind of Christian intervention into politics, mostly on the basis of kind of what it calls Catholic social thought, which is Catholic social teaching, but we call it thought to make it sound less authoritative.
We call it...
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St. George's College in Jerusalem, says, I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering. To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
Catholic social thought. I've only read them saying Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, all over the place.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, no, it's just Catholic social thought. To be fair, there's a lot of people call it that when they're trying to draw on it, but they're not necessarily Catholic, or they don't necessarily want to say, well, this is the exact line we have to take.
Well, it's like how the sort of equivalent in Anglicanism is Anglican social theology.
Yes.
And they had theology rather than teaching because theology seems more sort of highfalutin, you know?
Yeah. I think what's interesting is I really like the concept of his charity, Hope into Action. And essentially, it's a charity that supports churches and people within churches to create or purchase homes for homeless people to live in. So it's essentially a kind of housing first approach to homelessness, which basically says you can't really solve much with homeless people until you get them housed, and then you can do things from there. Which is a positive idea.
It is a positive, but very brief caveat on that. It is sort of a housing first thing, but they do also charge rent and kick people out if they don't pay their rent.
Yes.
There's clearly a lot of good stuff and good ideas in there, but I think, there's some bits that we might take some issue with as well.
But on a broad level, actually, housing homeless people and encouraging churches and Christians to take an active role in the housing of homeless people, rather than any sort of punitive or police prison-based approach to homelessness, which is what we do see sometimes. I think that's it's a positive idea. We might have issues about how it comes out in the wash.
Yeah.
And it's one that is, in its own way, quite radical. You know, actually, although there are places in the world where the housing first approach is the default approach, it's still, in this country, quite a controversial idea. It has been put in place in places and it is successful, but...
I mean, most people have never even heard of it, let's face it.
Yeah. But, it's the classic issues with it about people saying, well, you've got to take personal responsibility before you can be trusted with a house and all that sort of stuff.
And also stuff around people getting annoyed about, the idea of people getting something for nothing,
Yeah. So anyway, I think he's someone who is doing something worthwhile, someone worth engaging with.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we say we've listened to something and we hate it, it's because it's horrible right-wing nonsense. In this case, it's actually... someone worth considering and worth engaging with on a serious level, even if we have some disagreements about the approach they take. So, we listened to this talk that he gave that is entitled The Future of Christian Social Action, Grace, Truth and the Common Good.
Which we'll link in the show notes. So, I mean, I first saw it because an extract from it appeared in the Church Times, but we've read and watched and listened to the full version. And we'll link all of those in the show notes.
So I think it's worth starting by just mentioning, Together for the Common Good, as we said, they're all about Catholic social thought, which is something that's been around for, 100 and a bit years as an idea within Catholic thought. And I don't want to call it a third way because that already means something else. But it also kind of means this as well. But essentially, it's both anti-capitalist and anti-socialist is how it tends to be described.
Which ultimately makes you capitalist, essentially.
Yeah. So essentially it says, look, capitalism isn't working. We need to do stuff about it. But the socialist approach doesn't work either. Their concept of what a socialist approach is often lacking. But that's kind of the general vibe of it. I think what's particularly interesting about it is that it is in some ways one of the major currents that leads to Latin American liberation theology.
Yeah.
And certainly Latin American liberation theology moves beyond Catholic social thought and takes it to a very different place. But actually the priorities and ideas within Catholic social thought are quite foundational in the thinking that comes to define Latin American liberation theology.
I mean, it's this whole sort of preferential option for the poor thing. Mm-hmm. And what does it mean to really take that seriously?
Yeah, because that's obviously an idea that we associate with liberation theology, the preparation.
Go on, have another go.
Preferential option for the poor. Man, that was a difficult one. But that's actually out of Catholic social teaching, right? That's an idea that first emerges from that. And liberations theology's contribution is to essentially say, actually, what does it mean to really take that seriously? What does that actually look like?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today fundamentally comes down to being grounded in Catholic social teaching rather than liberation theology, and recognizing that actually Catholic social teaching kind of can and perhaps should lead you towards full liberation theology. But if you don't allow that to happen, you end up in an odd and slightly sticky place with your thinking.
I think all of that is true. The one sort of caveat to that, I would say, is that clearly Jon Kuhrt is doing this lecture for a sort of Catholic parachurch kind of organization, but he himself is a Baptist and an evangelical. And so a lot of that comes out too. But actually, with Catholic social teaching and sort of more evangelical approaches to what he would call social action, there's actually a lot of overlap there, a lot of the same sort of philosophical underpinnings. So that's how you end up with this lecture where they're sort of fairly well aligned.
Yeah, absolutely. The lecture is actually in memory of the late Labour MP Frank Field, and it kind of starts with quite a moving tribute to Frank Field. Unfortunately, I think it's fair to say that we were not particular fans of Frank Field.
Frank Field is someone who, obviously, I've known who Frank Field was for many years and known that he has a concern for poverty. And I don't doubt that concern. I think it's a genuine concern. But reading more about him and listening to him more for this has been quite interesting because he just seems really quite inconsistent. Like that's the best I can say about him, is that, and it's not like, yes, okay, his thought has changed over time, but it doesn't seem to follow like a trajectory as such. Like he wouldn't be out of place in any of the major, you wouldn't be surprised to find him in any of the major political parties.
No.
I mean, that's the thing about him, is that he just is basically very inconsistent and certainly doesn't have a coherent ideology that he would recognise anyway.
I think in a lot of ways he's the forerunner of what we now call Blue Labour, right? Which I would also suggest is a fairly incoherent ideology, but some level of redistribution and social justice combined with ultimately
social conservatism,
social values. Yeah. And he was, famously he was put in by the Blair government to do some welfare reform and was booted back out again by the Blair government for being, I don't want to say too radical, but radical in the wrong direction.
And ultimately it was Gordon Brown and Harriet Harman, but Gordon Brown he was disagreeing with, because Gordon Brown wanted a means-tested system, which, we're not going to like as much as, say, a sort of universalist system. And actually, there's an element of universalist approach to benefits and welfare and that kind of thing in Frank Field from time to time, just very inconsistently. But it was Gordon Brown he disagreed with, because Gordon Brown did actually feel that the poor should be able to get benefits without having to make national insurance contributions. It wasn't, for Gordon Brown, it wasn't a something for something approach. It was, people do need the help, so we should give them the help.
So anyway, just to briefly touch on Field a little bit more, I think it was quite revealing that he was actually good mates with both Margaret Thatcher and Enoch Powell. And not just in that, we have political differences, but, we can still be friends sort of way. But actually, he shared a lot of their views on a bunch of stuff, particularly Enoch Powell. Yeah. He was actually compared by the Bishop of Worcester, Peter Selby, to Powell, because they shared quite similar views on immigration. Frank Field was virulently anti-immigration. And when a Church of England bishop is coming out and pretty directly calling you a racist, you've really crossed the line there.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're sitting, parliamentarian, that is quite a major thing to have occurred.
I linked something in the show notes, actually. It's a Spectator. So I said that the BBC wasn't the worst thing I'd linked today, didn't I? It might be, I don't know which is worse, Daily Mail or Spectator, but it's an article by Frank Field that I think is actually, it's an essay taken from the book Enoch at 100, which is a book of essays about Enoch Powell to mark his centenary. And this particular essay by Frank Field appears in The Spectator, and it's called Enoch Powell as a Parliamentarian. And I don't know if you read it, it's a fascinating read, just because, and I don't want to be nasty fine, I'll do it. you realise how basically clueless Frank Field was about how people become radicalised and how the right works. Because it's all about the things that he found so incredible about Enoch Powell. And basically, the only thing he thought that Enoch Powell erred on was the infamous Rivers of Blood speech. Everything else, he's like, yeah, he was great.
Yeah. It's a big though, isn't it? It is fairly major.
Yeah, well, and also, it's not out of character. Do you know what I mean? Because Enoch Powell was a fascist. That's what he was. And so for Frank Field to see him as such an incredible parliamentarian and to become friends with him and so on, and get drunk with him with his mum, I think says a lot, actually, about Frank Field's political thought and his sort of political life, really, which, again, is also reflected in this thing with Thatcher as well.
So Jon Kuhrt talks about Frank Field a little bit, and he says, Frank was concerned that the reality of sinful human nature meant that effective welfare systems cannot simply be based on altruism alone. We have to work with the grain of human nature as it really is. We need grace, but we also need truth. And I think, yeah, that kind of sets the tone a little bit for what he's driving at. And, I think you'd obviously start by talking about a kind of Marxist criticism of the idea of a fixed human nature, which I think we've talked about before. But essentially, the Marxist idea is that human nature is produced by the context in which it emerges, by the systems around it, by the way that society and capitalism forces you to become a certain type of person. Yeah. So, we would say actually human nature is not a fixed thing. It is something that is produced by the context in which it is created. But nonetheless, I think there is, that really sets out the big ideas of the speech, which is essentially to add a personal responsibility narrative alongside the kind of social action approach that's in place. So I think we should try and acknowledge some of the positives in this speech. There's a real acknowledgement of the devastating impact of austerity on working class communities and then the country at large, and actually looks at the kind of growth of various initiatives in kind of response to austerity. Your street pastors, debt centres, food banks, community supermarkets, night shelters, even warm hubs is the latest one, and kind of recognises that those are coming from a really positive place of people wanting to care for others, motivated by their Christian faith, but also wanting to say, well, actually, if all you're doing is responding to the bad stuff, that's not going to stop the bad stuff happening. You're merely alleviating the impacts of it.
And I think this is the core, A, of what he's saying here, but also B, I think actually of our own critique of the sort of charity model. We've made these same points on this podcast a bunch of times about how charities ultimately, unless they are sort of engaging in ways, not just challenge the status quo, but actually foment class consciousness, really you are just doing what he says and propping up an unjust system. I think we sort of part ways at that point. So we have the same disagreement, but my question would be, how deep does his criticism of that unjust system go? Because you and I want to get rid of that system, whereas I think he kind of wants to tweak it, essentially. But he will see that as very radical. What he's doing there is very radical. And, in some ways you can argue it is, because it's, it's certainly different to what we've got within that acceptable window.
Yeah, I think, we can recognise that radical reform can still be radical, can still involve major changes, while still being reform. And ultimately, reform is not what we're looking for. But then there's this idea of non-reformist reforms that comes
just
out
about to say that, yeah.
Yeah, it comes out particularly out of the kind of abolitionist movement, and it's a really helpful framework to think about these things, because ultimately, when the possibility of certain reforms comes up, we do have to make a choice about whether we support them or oppose them. And simply saying, well, reform is bad, so we're not going to engage with any sort of reform, is not a particularly helpful way of approaching this stuff. And the idea of non-reformist reforms is essentially that there are reforms that will, I'm saying the word reforms too many times, but there are reforms that will actually set the basis for more fundamental change. So not just harm reduction, which is important as well, but also that there are certain types of reform that reinforce the system, that by changing the system to make it better or more reasonable or more ethical, they actually reinforce the power of the system. And there are other reforms that undermine the system, not necessarily intentionally, but actually make the system less strong, less dangerous. And, we would want to avoid reforms that ultimately reinforce the system, but we could support those non-reformist reforms. And I think there are things that fall in both categories that Jon Kuhrt proposes in this piece. He also raises a couple of really good questions. Has enthusiasm for social action led the church to become a handmaid of the state, propping up an unjust system, or filling in the gaps caused by its negligence? And have these projects been effective at reducing poverty in sustainable ways? Those are two really good questions. And I think understanding the answers to those questions is really important. However, we do go to a very different place. Although we would agree in both the cases, the answer is yes and no to those questions. Actually, what we do about that is quite a different answer that we come up with. However, before we go on to talk about that, I think we should take a brief pause to do our Saint of the Week.
Saint of the Week.
Adam, I believe you have a Saint of the Week for us.
Yes. So I want to start by taking you back to the 60s, the swinging 60s.
In the edit, would you mind putting some kind of jazzy swinging stuff in there?
Yeah, no, I will. So in 1960, Nigeria declared independence. Independence from the UK, it's important to say.
What were we doing there?
Yeah. One of the many places that was declaring independence around that time from the UK. Now, the formal decolonisation period ended in 1963, but there were really deep ethnic and regional divisions within Nigeria, particularly between the north, which was a predominantly Hausa Fulani area, the west, which was a predominantly Yoruba area, and the east, which was a predominantly Igbo area. And the discovery of oil around that time really kind of intensified these issues as well. And so in 1966, there were a series of military coups followed by really awful anti-Igbo pogroms. And that led to the eastern region seceding from Nigeria and declaring it an independent republic called the Republic of Biafra in 1967. So that was the start of the Nigerian Civil War. And of course, the UK was keen to protect its oil interests in the area as well. So it supported the Nigerian government during the war, providing arms and diplomatic backing and so on, which of course only prolonged it and made it worse and the humanitarian crisis worse as well. Anyway, the war ended in 1970 and it had, pretty devastating consequences, particularly for Biafra. However, Biafra was integrated back into Nigeria a little bit more easily than these things often happen. There was a real effort to kind of prevent any more bloodshed. They didn't go after people for wanting to be independent. They didn't, they were integrated fairly well. Now, in that civil war, obviously you've got a lot of people who are fighting on both sides, but especially a lot of people fighting for the Nigerian state. And you've got two young-ish men. One is a Nigerian military officer called Sani Abacha. And one is a young man called Ken Saro-Wiwa, who is our Saint of the Week this week. Ken Saro-Wiwa would go on to become a very prominent activist, and he would found an organization called MOSOP, Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People. So Ken Saro-Wiwa was from the ethnic group within Nigeria called the Ogoni. So they discovered, I think it was actually the Nigerian state kind of energy company, or the Nigerian state anyway, discovered that there was oil in the region that was occupied by the Ogoni people. Now, during the Civil War, you've got these two guys, Ken Saro-Wiwa and Sani Abacha, who are from different ethnic groups and different religions as well. So Ken Saro-Wiwa is a Christian, Sani Abacha is a Muslim. But they apparently got on pretty well, and they used to play tennis together. They didn't really have a relationship going forward, I don't think, but they had that kind of history. Now, as the decades go on, the Nigerian state energy company find it really difficult actually to extract the oil from Ogoniland. And so what happens is you get these foreign oil companies, particularly what was then Royal Dutch Shell. And yeah, you can see where this is going.
Yeah, I was just saying, and they're the good guys, right?
Yeah, not so much. So oil companies, as we know, are generally responsible for some pretty awful, pretty horrific things. And what happens is these oil companies, in particular Shell, come in and they extract this oil and they absolutely destroy the local area. They're terrible for the environment, terrible for the people. They pollute the area really badly. People get ill. And so people start to campaign against it. And one of the most prominent people is Ken Saro-Wiwa, who started this movement called MOSOP. And he was very clear that this was a non-violent campaign against the environmental degradation of the land and the water, but also of what was happening because of that to the Ogoni people. So there's a nationalist element to it as well. Nationalist in the kind of
more in the Irish than in the English sense.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, what ends up happening? So the Nigerian state and Shell are on and off in cahoots with each other. Now, what happened with a lot of states that declared independence around sort of the 60s is that they go through various periods of political instability. There are power vacuums, all that kind of thing. And Nigeria, over the decades, goes through various periods of civilian democratic rule and various periods of military dictatorship. And the last of these military dictatorships comes into power in November 1993. There's a coup in 1993, and it ends in 1990. I think it's 1999, but late 90s. And the general who becomes the military dictator is this guy called Sani Abacha.
Right.
Yeah. Now, what's happening at this point is this movement for the sort of liberation of the Ogoni people and of Ogoni land from these awful oil companies. It's pretty big and it's got international recognition. And Ken Saro-Wiwa in particular is a very sort of charismatic guy because he's a writer, he's a teacher, he's a television producer. And at one point he worked actually for the government as well. So he knows how to handle himself in the media and how to conduct sort of campaigns. What happens is in 94, 4 of the more conservative leaders in the MOSOP movement are murdered. And the government basically pins the blame on a bunch of people and tries them all before a military court. And some of them are let go in what a lot of people think is a way of sort of giving the government this facade, if you like, this visage of credibility and of decency and so on. But 9 of them, who became known as the Ogoni 9, are sentenced to death. And one of those people is Ken Saro-Wiwa. Now, this is clearly a miscarriage of justice. Very early on in the case, a bunch of the lawyers leave the case, as in the defense lawyers leave the case because they're like, this is so obviously a stitch up that there's no point us even being here. And they sort of resign in protest. And they're hoping, I think, that, this will bring international pressure. And there is international pressure, significant international pressure, but they're hoping that basically this will just sort of get rid of the whole thing. But it doesn't. And what ends up happening is that a significant number of the people who are being tried are basically left to defend themselves. So they're tried, they're convicted very quickly. And then the following year, so within a year, they are executed, including Ken Saro-Wiwa. So a couple of years after that, Sani Abacha dies of what officially is a heart attack, but there's some question as to whether he was poisoned and who by and all that kind of thing. But he dies, and then his replacement as dictator pretty immediately says, yeah, no, we're going to have elections. And what happens is they set up an inquest as well into some of the stuff that happened under Sani Abacha, because Sani Abacha was a really brutal military dictator. And one of the things that comes out is this whole thing about Ken Saro-Wiwa and Sani Abacha apparently having played tennis together and been sort of friends, in the 60s. And apparently, Ken Saro-Wiwa honestly didn't believe that he would be executed because the president has to confirm any executions.
Right.
Or he can, say, no, this is not going to happen. And he thought that his old friend would commute his sentence, but he didn't. He was executed. Now, one of the elements that is often missing about Ken Saro-Wiwa is that he was clearly driven by, yes, a commitment to, the anti-colonial struggle, the sort of anti-corporate kind of struggle, and to environmentalism. But he was also driven by his faith. Now, he wasn't as explicit about this as some might be, because it was a broad-based movement. Nigeria is quite a religious, not just an ethnically diverse country, but quite a religiously diverse country as well.
Yeah.
But he was clearly religious. His final words were words of defiance. He said, "Lord, take my soul, but the struggle continues." But for him, it was also clear that God stood on the side of the oppressed, and that the struggle for justice was completely inseparable from his faith. And it wasn't just about personal piety or quiet reflection. It had to be a radical, action-oriented faith, which is something that Jon Kuhrt would like, I think, the action. And so that kind of made his critique extend beyond the corporate greed of, say, Shell, and actually to critique the military dictatorship as well. So whilst he may not have thought he would be executed, it was at least probably partly that sealed his fate, but also as well that corporate element of it where the Nigerian military dictatorship really wanted that money. Because one of the things about Sani Abacha is that corruption extended to amassing a huge fortune, right? So he's raking off a lot of money from this into his personal coffers that ended up in places like Switzerland and also in the UK. So there's that link again.
Yeah.
But yes, the point is that Ken Saro-Wiwa was very much driven by his faith, not in a way that was there to shame other people or to say that his faith was better than theirs, but clearly in a way that was to say that God is on the side of the oppressed, and he held onto that faith and onto that spirit of struggle right up until his dying moment. So that is our saint of the week for this week, Ken Saro-Wiwa.
Thank you very much for that. I never heard of him, but that's a wonderful thing. I think it's always good to hear kind of anti-colonial and environmental struggles, which are often intertwined, as we know, but kind of the stories of Christians involved in that, because for obvious reasons, a lot of the time kind of traditional religions or other religions are centered within that. And that's right and good, obviously. But to hear kind of a Christian involved in those struggles is quite an inspiring story.
Saint of the week.
So, to return to our friend Jon Kuhrt, we are going to pick up on a couple of themes and kind of unpick a little bit. And the first of those is charity versus justice. And actually, he's very good at acknowledging the kind of limitations of charity and the need for this justice-oriented approach to address the systemic issues that surround poverty in this country. And he says, we need to ask how the growth of social action connects to questioning the underlying social and economic systems that create such a need in the first place, which I think we'd probably agree with, right? And it's that idea of non-reformist reforms again. And he almost seems to get there.
Yeah.
There's a bit where he says that social justice in a church affected by capitalist culture, social justice can become a commodity and a superficial brand. And I think there's some truth to that. But ultimately, he kind of backs away from it. And he bases it in this kind of almost original sin inflected idea of human nature. And kind of says, well, in the real world, people are broken, struggles are messy, things are really difficult. And there's a part of me that wants to affirm that, right? You know, if you work with people that have had real challenges and have gone through or are going through real struggles, sometimes they're going to be difficult, unpleasant people. And that doesn't mean that you just give up on them. It means that actually you have to acknowledge that not everyone who's suffered, not everyone who's oppressed is that nicer person, or that actually the pressure that they've been under, only saints come out the other side, you know, spouting pieties. So there is some truth to that. I think it's really important. But what it ultimately seems like is that rather than saying we need to look at a systemic level rather than individual level, he almost doubles down on the individualism, and kind of says, you actually need to push people to take responsibility, push people to do more, rather than saying, actually, it's not about the individual, it's the system itself will inevitably produce this sort of stuff, and it doesn't matter how nice or worthy the individual person who's suffering is. What matters is the system that produces that person and that suffering.
I think it's important to recognise that I don't think we're saying that there are never times when you don't need to have a frank conversation with someone. But I think the key here is that it seems for him, that is a pretty central element of it. I know for a damn fact that there are people who would benefit from someone close to them saying, look, this is how it is, and you're taking a piss here in this particular area. But when you completely separate that from a sort of materialist critique, you end up in a place where you're not really understanding how they've even ended up there.
Yeah. It's not really a solution, fundamentally, for all the critique of actually getting the underlying power structures, to then fall back on individualism is to ignore the underlying power structures. And what really struck me was the similarity to what he's saying and the sort of thing Trump's vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, is saying. He became famous for essentially, he's from the Midwest, and basically talking about how the culture of the working class in the Midwest keeps them in poverty. And it's a very, very conservative approach that blames the individual rather than the system. It's almost a jarring shift of tone from this guy who has really hit the nail on the head about actually the failures of charity compared to the need for fundamental change. And then to say, and the fundamental change is that we've got to be nastier to poor people, seems an odd solution, if it's a solution at all.
This is where you really see the sort of centrist turn, which is probably why he's been invited to talk to Together for the Common Good, because ultimately they do share that very sort of centrist approach of kind of having individual responsibility being at the heart of it. But also, it leads him to be pretty critical of the left and the right, almost in a way that can sort of run the risk of seeming like they're two sides of the same coin, essentially, which, of course, they're not. But we want to focus on the left, his criticism of the left. And he has a blog post as well, where he talks about needing to listen less to populist applause in either right or left-wing echo chambers, and to be willing to bravely challenge both sides. And then he sort of says Frank Field did this quite well because he broke the ultimate taboo on the left, which is his friendship with Margaret Thatcher, and that despite their different politics, there was mutual respect and conviction and courage that they saw in each other. Which, honestly, I don't think their politics were that different, really. Like, there were some differences, but not a whole lot. But also, he goes on to say that, it reminds him of discussions at his university with the left-wing orthodoxy, that he found it monochrome and self-righteous and frustrating, and that to even ask why did working-class people vote for Thatcher was to invite denunciation.
Well, I mean, it should do, because the answer is they basically didn't.
There was more of it in the 80s, the late 70s and 80s.
To some extent.
But, most didn't.
It basically relies on redefining the petty bourgeois as working class, right?
Yeah.
If you run a corner shop, you're not working class, you own the means of production. And actually, if you redefine working class to mean anyone with a regional accent, or from a particular social background.
It's the affect of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think this is very clear when he says that he was not convinced by the stock answers of selfishness and media bias. And actually, media bias is actually huge. It's huge. And so to sort of reject that out of hand is a bit confusing to me, because, you've got huge amounts written on this. You've got entire theories like Gramsci's cultural hegemony formulated on this. You've got Chomsky and Herman manufacturing consent. I just don't think you can dismiss that as quickly as I think he does here. But it's sort of telling, I think, that he ends that with the refusal to see just cause in elements of Thatcher's approach was a continual weakness of the left. And to me, that's quite telling, I think.
I think there's a reason it's Thatcher he's talking about, right? Which is, yes, obviously to do with his age, but also to do with the fact that Thatcher was the person who really ushered in that new era of neoliberalism with that new, actually new ideas of human nature, new ideas of what it meant to be a person.
Yeah.
And actually, all through this talk that he's given, it's very clear that he has bought into what we would obnoxiously call neoliberal subjectivity, the ideas of what it means to be a person that are part and parcel of the neoliberal era, right? So actually, if you buy into that, then yeah, you're going to see at least some level of just cause within the Thatcher government, even if, you might say, well, really, I'm a bit more left than that. But because ultimately you've bought into the more general ideas that were ushered in that era.
Yeah, exactly. And I think he would want to kick back against that, and I understand why. Like, he does talk about things like the individualism that was brought in with neoliberalism and that kind of thing. Like, he acknowledges some of this stuff, but I'm not sure he always realizes how it creeps into his own thought. And I think this is, I think we want to be clear here. I certainly don't dislike this guy. Like, I don't know him. And I think he comes across as someone who is doing some really good work and someone who really cares. And I'm sure he knows a hell of a lot about it. He's been working in it for many years.
Yeah.
But I think there's just a lot of blind spots there. And I think touching on some of that lefty stuff again, ironically, there are a lot of socialist thinkers who agree with him up to a point, but would actually really help him bring some depth to the analysis. So, for example, Marx and Engels, their principle of self-emancipation, the idea that, the working classes have to emancipate themselves rather than having someone else do it for them, which gets into some pretty interesting discussions around sort of vanguardism and that kind of thing. But then, people like Paulo Freire and his what we in English would call conscientization or critical consciousness or consciousness raising. These are ways that you can approach from a left-wing position. You can approach some of these criticisms that he has that he doesn't engage with at all, certainly not in this lecture. And I think that's a shame, because I think, he dismisses the left as basically superficial. But the irony of that is that I think actually his critique is quite superficial, and it could be a lot deeper if he engaged with some of this stuff. And maybe he has elsewhere, but I don't see any of it coming through here.
I think it's, to talk about that stuff actually is to recognise that he's onto something when he says that a lot of charity is, I guess, infantilizing. It, turns you into a passive recipient. And sometimes there is not value in that, but in a famine situation, it is fine to simply give out enough food for people to survive and turn them into passive recipients of that, because that's what needs to happen. Yeah. However, actually, in a big picture, yes, you do need to empower individuals, but the way you empower them is not by telling them you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah.
It's actually by empowering them to understand, yes, what level of personal responsibility they have, but that personal responsibility only exists in a broader context of power structures, and that actually the most empowering thing is allowing someone to understand for themselves how they've been screwed over. And that's not about saying to someone, oh, you should be self-pitying, all the rest of it. And it's not saying, well, there's nothing you do about anything. It's not fatalistic, but it's giving people the tools to understand their place in the world and the way they have been impacted by the power structures. That is ultimately the most empowering way of approaching this. And ultimately, it is baked into the structure of capitalism that only a certain number of people will be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? Yeah. Not everyone can do that, because if everyone did that, there would be no one left to be the working class, to be the lumpen proletariat, the industrial reserve army, whatever fancy Marxist phrases you want to use. You have to have the haves and the have-nots, and some of the have-nots can become haves. Social mobility is part of the thing that makes capitalism kind of palatable to people, but not a lot of them can. And you can tell a few people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. You can help a few people to turn their own lives around. But unless you give them the tools to understand their own place in the world and the way they've been impacted by these power structures, they're never actually going to be empowered.
And I think one of the things that's quite interesting here is that he will talk about giving people the tools as well, but it's a different set of tools. And I think that's seen in a brief example here. He says that running a class to help 10 people cook for themselves is better than giving out free food to 100 people. And I want to say, okay, but these two things meet different needs, right? If you don't have any food to cook with, but you're a good cook, you still can't eat. But also there's an element of it, like, some people can't cook, fine. maybe there do need to be cooking classes. I think that can be a really helpful thing. But actually, a lot of people, they can cook. They just don't have the means, they don't have the money, they don't have the resources.
And the time as well, I think that's
and the
really
time,
important.
which is a resource, right?
Yeah.
But, ultimately, both of them may be required. And I think that's reflected in the way he sort of thinks about foreign aid as well, and doesn't really conceptualize that within the broader framework of global financial systems being designed to disempower the global south. There's a parallel there between how he's thinking about how you approach poverty on the ground in the UK and how we approach it on a global scale, in light of things like neocolonialism and that kind of thing, which I don't think he really talks about. So he does quote someone briefly, a book about aid and toxic charity and that kind of thing, but ultimately ends up making a very similar argument that I think falls down because it doesn't take the entire context into account.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately our big critique here, is that you can only talk about personal responsibility in the context of the structural powers that exist, and you can't simply ask someone to do better in a power system that is set up to prevent the majority of people doing better, because that is just a losing game, and you might get one or two people that succeed, but actually the vast majority of people are going to be stuck exactly where they started, but having had a telling off from a middle-class Christian. I think that is probably just about all we've got time for today. We've been talking quite a few times about charity, and it's been good to unpack that a little bit. I think we might come back at some point to talk some more about foreign aid and the way that charitable interventions in post-colonial countries are worthy of critique and worth thinking about in a broader, more structural sense. So perhaps we will do an episode on that in future. But for now, I think we will draw our conversation to a close. Adam, thank you very much, as always. Where in the world can people find you?
You can find me on, I normally say on most platforms, but I think there's so many of them now that that's probably not true anymore. But you can certainly find me on Twitter and TikTok, and my handle is @CommieXIAN.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode. You can find us in all your usual podcast feedy places. Recommend us to your friends, why don't you? Give us a review. Have a wild old time with it. If you want to get in contact with us, we'd love to hear from you. Thoughts, feedbacks, questions, suggestions, all of which are gratefully received. All the information for that can be found at breadandrosaries.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.
See you later.